It was a warm summer morning in the early 1980s. Nikki, a vibrant and kind-hearted woman in her early 20s, had always prided herself on helping those in need. She was the type of person who saw the good in everyone and believed in giving people second chances. Living in a small, quiet town meant hitchhikers were a common sight, and Nikki often found herself offering rides to those who looked stranded. Her friends had warned her many times, saying, "Nikki, one day you're going to pick up the wrong person." But she'd always wave off their concerns, insisting, "It's just a small act of kindness. What's the worst that could happen?" Unfortunately for Nikki, she was about to find out. One Friday morning, Nikki was driving into the city for some errands. As she approached the edge of town, she noticed a man standing on the shoulder of the road. He was young, likely in his mid-20s, with a thin frame and a shy demeanor. His clothes were slightly worn, and he carried a small, tattered backpack. Nikki slowed her car and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" she asked, flashing her warm, inviting smile. The man hesitated for a moment, glancing around nervously before nodding. "Yeah, if you don't mind," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. He climbed into the passenger seat, clutching his backpack tightly. Nikki tried to make conversation as they drove, asking him where he was headed and what he did for work. He answered in short, clipped sentences, avoiding eye contact. Despite his awkwardness, Nikki didn't feel threatened. If anything, she felt sorry for him. About halfway to the city, Nikki's stomach growled, and she laughed, embarrassed. "Mind if we stop for a quick bite?" she asked. The man nodded, seeming relieved. They pulled into a small diner along the highway, and Nikki ordered a burger and fries. She noticed the man nervously fumbling with his pockets, clearly embarrassed that he didn't have enough money for a meal. "Don't worry about it," Nikki said, smiling as she handed the waitress enough to cover both meals. "This one's on me." The man's face flushed with gratitude. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly. As they ate, Nikki tried to lighten the mood. She talked about her life, her plans for the weekend, and her dreams of traveling the world. The man listened intently, nodding occasionally but offering little about himself. After finishing their meal, they got back on the road. When they reached the city, Nikki pulled over near a bus stop. "This is close enough," the man said, finally looking her in the eyes for the first time. "Thank you for everything." He hesitated for a moment before asking, "Could I get your number? Just in case I want to return the favor someday." Nikki was taken aback but didn't want to seem rude. She scribbled her number on a scrap of paper and handed it to him. The man gave a small, shy smile before stepping out of the car and disappearing into the crowd. A week later, Nikki was at home when her phone rang. She answered, expecting to hear the voice of a friend or family member. Instead, it was the man. "Hey, Nikki," he said, his voice low and steady. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. "Who is this?" "It's me. The guy you gave a ride to last week," he replied. Nikki felt a pang of unease. "Oh, hi," she said hesitantly. "Is everything okay?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I need to tell you something," he said. His tone was calm but carried a strange, ominous weight. "When you picked me up," he continued, "I wasn't in a good place. I had plans, bad ones. I was going to hurt you." Nikki's blood ran cold. She gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I couldn't do it," the man said, his voice cracking. "You were so kind to me. You treated me like a person. No one's done that for me in a long time." Nikki was too shocked to speak. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help me," he admitted. "But listen to me, don't ever pick up another hitchhiker. Promise me that. You might not be so lucky next time." With that, he hung up, leaving Nikki in stunned silence. The call haunted her for weeks. Every time she replayed the conversation in her mind, she couldn't help but wonder how close she had come to disaster. She thought about the way he had clutched his backpack so tightly, how he had avoided eye contact, and how his gratitude had seemed almost desperate. From that day on, Nikki made a vow to herself. No more hitchhiker. She couldn't risk it, not after coming so close to danger. Even years later, the memory of that encounter stayed with her, a chilling reminder of how even the smallest acts of kindness can carry unexpected risks. It was a bitterly cold night in rural New Jersey, the kind of night where the air bites at your skin, and the world feels eerily quiet. The driver, a man in his late 20s, was on his way home from a long day of work. His route took him down a winding, wooded road, a shortcut he'd driven dozens of times before. The narrow road was lined with towering trees that cast long shadows under the pale moonlight. The only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the faint rustling of wind through the branches. It was late, and he was eager to get home and collapse into bed. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a man wearing a hoodie, his face obscured by the shadow of the hood. He stood motionless, his hand raised in the universal signal for a ride. The driver's initial instinct was to keep going, his mother's voice echoing in his head, "Never pick up strangers at night." But as he passed, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man lowering his arm, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Guilt tugged at him. It was freezing outside, and the man looked alone and desperate. Against his better judgment, the driver pulled over. He rolled down the passenger window slightly and asked, "Need a ride?" The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, thanks," he said, his voice low and hoarse. The man climbed into the passenger seat, clutching a worn backpack. He didn't say much as they started driving, just stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his lap. The driver tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed, but the hitchhiker's answers were short and vague. "Into town," he muttered. His body language was stiff, and his hood remained up, obscuring most of his face. An uncomfortable silence settled over the car. The driver couldn't help but glance at the man every so often, noting how he fidgeted with his hands and occasionally muttered under his breath. Something about him felt off. As they drove deeper into the woods, the hitchhiker suddenly shifted in his seat. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a knife. "Pull over," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. The driver's heart stopped. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as adrenaline surged through his veins. "Listen, man, I don't want any trouble," the driver said, his voice shaking. "Just pull over," the hitchhiker repeated, raising the knife slightly. The driver obeyed, steering the car onto the shoulder and coming to a stop. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of the situation. The hitchhiker sat silently, gripping the knife as he stared out the windshield. "You ever feel like you just can't take it anymore?" the hitchhiker said suddenly, his voice trembling. The driver didn't respond, unsure of what to say. The hitchhiker continued, "I've been thinking about ending it. Tonight. Just needed someone to take me into town first." The driver realized the man wasn't just dangerous, he was unstable. Every instinct screamed at him to get out of the car, but he knew any sudden movement could set the man off. "I'll get out," the driver said carefully, reaching for the door handle. As he stepped out of the car, he pretended to fumble with his keys, acting as though he was about to walk away. The moment the hitchhiker glanced down at the knife, the driver made his move. He dove back into the car, slammed the door, and hit the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, gravel spraying as the tires struggled for traction. The hitchhiker screamed and banged on the window, but the driver didn't stop. He drove as fast as he could, his hands trembling on the wheel. He didn't slow down until he reached a brightly lit gas station miles down the road. Inside, the driver told the attendant what had happened and asked to call the police. Officers arrived shortly after, but by the time they searched the area, the hitchhiker was long gone. For weeks after the incident, the driver couldn't shake the image of the man's face, or the knife glinting in the dim light of the car. He realized how close he had come to real danger and vowed never to pick up another hitchhiker again. Even now, he avoids driving down that wooded road at night, haunted by the memory of the man in the hoodie and the chilling encounter that could have ended so differently. It was supposed to be a fun night, a party filled with music, laughter, and plenty of drinks. The narrator, a 16-year-old high school student, had begged their parents for permission to attend. They promised to stay out of trouble, assuring their parents they had a designated driver lined up. But as the night wore on, things didn't go as planned. The party was in full swing, held at a friend of a friend's house in the outskirts of town. The narrator, caught up in the excitement, had more drinks than they intended. By the time they realized their designated driver was nowhere to be found, it was well past midnight. "Where's Jake?" the narrator slurred, asking a friend. "Left hours ago," their friend replied, shrugging. Panic set in. The house was in a rural area, surrounded by empty fields and dark, winding roads. There were no buses, no rideshares, and everyone else at the party was too drunk to drive. With no other options, the narrator decided to hitchhike home. Stumbling down the driveway, they stuck out their thumb as car after car passed by, their headlights illuminating the desolate road. Finally, a beat-up sedan slowed down and pulled over. The driver, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair and a tired face, rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. The narrator nodded, climbing into the passenger seat without hesitation. The car smelled faintly of cigarettes and coffee, and the man said little as they drove. Exhausted and slightly drunk, the narrator quickly dozed off, lulled by the hum of the engine. When they woke up, something was wrong. The car wasn't heading toward their neighborhood. Instead, it was driving down a narrow, unfamiliar road surrounded by dense woods. The towering trees seemed to close in around the car, their shadows dancing in the moonlight. "Hey," the narrator said groggily, sitting up. "Where are we?" The driver didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I think you missed my turn," the narrator said, their voice trembling slightly. The man finally spoke, his tone cold and detached. "You'll get there. Eventually." Fear surged through the narrator as they realized they were in serious danger. The doors were locked, and the man's demeanor had shifted. His silence was no longer tired but menacing. Desperate to escape, the narrator came up with a plan. They groaned loudly, clutching their stomach. "I think I'm gonna be sick," they said, leaning forward as though about to vomit. The driver glanced at them, annoyed. "Hold it in," he snapped. "I can't," the narrator shouted, making retching noises. The man cursed under his breath and pulled the car to the side of the road. As soon as he stopped, the narrator leaned over and vomited, deliberately aiming for his lap. The driver recoiled in disgust, yelling and trying to clean himself off. Taking advantage of the distraction, the narrator unlocked the door and bolted out of the car, sprinting into the woods. Branches scratched their arms and face as they ran, their heart pounding in their chest. Behind them, they could hear the man shouting, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he searched for them. "Come back here," he yelled, his voice echoing through the trees. The narrator ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes, holding their breath as the flashlight beam swept past them. They could hear the man's heavy footsteps, getting closer and closer. After what felt like an eternity, the man gave up. The flashlight beam disappeared, and the woods fell silent. The narrator stayed hidden for a few more minutes before cautiously making their way back to the road. Their legs were trembling, and every shadow seemed to move as they stumbled along the shoulder, desperate for another car to pass by. Finally, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. The narrator waved frantically, and the car slowed to a stop. This time, the driver was an older woman with kind eyes. She listened in horror as the narrator explained what had happened and drove them straight to the nearest police station. Though the narrator escaped unharmed, the experience left them shaken. They regretted not getting the first driver's license plate number, which could have helped the police track him down. For weeks after the incident, they couldn't sleep without replaying the events of that night in their head, the unfamiliar road, the man's cold tone, the beam of the flashlight searching for them in the woods. One thing was certain, they would never hitchhike again.